He came back to his family farm after 15 years, expecting dead silence and a house that had given up. Instead, smoke was rising from the chimney, fresh tracks crossed the snow, and someone had kept the place alive. Inside were two women who had nowhere else to go, and a home that no longer looked abandoned. What began as a legal fight over land slowly became something far more human. Because the stranger he feared had not stolen his life. She had protected part of it. And on one frozen Idaho winter, a veteran, a loyal German shepherd, and 3 wounded hearts were forced to choose what mattered most. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story stays with you, you're welcome to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. He had chosen the longest route back on purpose, not because the roads were better. In northern Idaho, in a winter that had come down hard and bright, every road held its own kind of trouble. Ice lived in the shaded bends. Snowbanks leaned in close where the plows had cut narrow passages through the pines. The sky was pale as old tin, and the fields lay under a clean white silence that made distance look gentler than it was. Silas Reed drove through it with both hands steady on the wheel. At 46, he had the kind of face people often mistook for calm when it was really restraint. His features had thinned with time rather than softened. A narrow, weathered face. A nose that had once been straight and no longer quite was. Hazel gray eyes that rarely stayed on one thing longer than necessary unless he was deciding whether it could hurt someone. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His olive combat shirt fit close through the torso, its camouflage sleeves disappearing beneath an old field jacket thrown open at the chest because the cab heater ran too hot and too unevenly. On his left wrist, a black-faced mechanical watch ticked on as if the last 15 years had been a clerical error. Mako occupied the passenger seat like a second silence. The German shepherd was 8 now, all controlled strength and winter-dark fur, with a dusting of early gray around the muzzle and one ear that tipped slightly outward at the top, as if refusing perfect obedience on principle. He did not pace or whine. He simply watched the windshield, then Silas, then the road again, the way creatures do when they have learned that waiting beside pain is sometimes more useful than trying to interrupt it. The county letter lay folded on the dash. Final appearance required, it had said in language cleaner than its intention. If Silas failed to appear at the hearing in person, the agricultural water use attached to Reed Farm and the winter access easement crossing the north side could be reclassified under revised county provisions. The land would still be his on paper for a while, but in practice, without water rights and winter access, the orchard would stop being an orchard. It would become what men in offices like to call non-viable. That word had stayed with him longer than it should have. Non-viable. As if a place could be pronounced half-dead by people who had never stood in its wind. He had told himself he was coming back for logistics, not grief. 2 nights, maybe 3. Sign what needed signing. Look at the buildings. Decide whether selling the whole place clean and final would feel more like mercy or surrender. Then leave. He had managed a life for 15 years by reducing everything to distances that could be crossed and tasks that could be completed. Town to town, job to job, room to truck, cab to roadside motel to room again. It was simpler that way. Simpler than admitting that he had not returned after his parents died because there were losses a man could survive only by refusing to look directly at them. The turnoff came without warning and with too much recognition. A weather-beaten post leaned at the side of the road where the old Reed sign had once hung. The sign itself was gone. The ruts in the long gravel drive had narrowed beneath packed snow, and the trees along the fence line seemed taller, heavier, as if the property had kept aging in his absence with the stubbornness of abandoned things. Silas eased off the gas. His chest did something small and unpleasant. He had expected ruin. He had prepared for ruin with the careful numbness of a man setting his jaw before impact. He had imagined the fence slumped into itself, orchard branches broken and wild, porch collapsed, windows gone black with weather and time. Maybe that would have been easier. Decay at least would have matched the shape of his guilt. Instead, the first fence post he saw had been reinforced with fresh lumber. Not perfect work, but recent. Functional. Farther up, the orchard came into view in long winter rows. Snow lay between the trees in clean drifts, but the branches had been cut back with intention. Dead weight removed. The lower limbs tied where the ice could split them. Someone had known enough or cared enough to keep them from breaking under the season. Silas slowed to a crawl. Mako leaned forward, ears up, gaze fixed. The farmhouse rose at last through the trees, and for one brief second, Silas thought he had taken a wrong road and found a memory instead. The place was still old, still bearing the exhaustion of years, but it was standing in a way that shook him. Smoke lifted in a thin gray ribbon from the chimney. The front walk had been shoveled. A bucket sat near the porch steps with a broom turned handle down into the snow. The east greenhouse, which should have been a sag of broken ribs by now, held panes patched with mismatched glass and cloudy plastic sheeting. Behind one section, faint with condensation, there was warmth. Then he saw the curtain move. He stopped the truck so suddenly the tires gave a dry crunch in the packed snow. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring. The world outside remained painfully ordinary. A crow lifted from the bare top of an apple tree. Wind worried the eaves. Somewhere beneath the cold air came the unmistakable smell of yeast and something browning in an oven. Bread. In his parents' house. Mako climbed down first when Silas opened the passenger door. The dog landed quietly, shook once, and stood with his body angled toward the porch. He did not bark. He did not charge. The fur along his shoulders stayed flat. That unsettled Silas more than aggression would have. He stepped out into air sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. Gravel and packed ice shifted beneath his boots. Every instinct old training had carved into him rose without permission. Notice the windows, note the tracks, map the approach, identify blind corners, listen for movement. But nothing about the place felt like an ambush. It felt inhabited. That was somehow worse. He moved up the shoveled path, his field jacket open, one gloved hand free, the county letter tucked in the inside pocket like a summons from another life. The porch boards groaned beneath his weight. Up close, he could see more signs of care. The latch repaired with a different screw than the original. A crack in the railing reinforced with wire and sanded wood. A ceramic pot tucked beside the door holding a rosemary plant that should not have survived the winter, but somehow had. He raised a hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles reached the wood. An older woman stood there first, small, narrow-shouldered, with silver-white hair pulled loosely back and hands shaped by work rather than age alone. Her cardigan was plain gray, and a flour-smudged apron crossed her front. But there was nothing frail about the way she held herself. Her eyes, light gray blue and very awake, went from Silas to Mako and back again. Behind her, in the warmer light of the kitchen, stood a younger woman in a dark sweater with the sleeves pushed up cleanly to her forearms. She looked to be in her late 30s, maybe just under 40, tall enough to feel steady in a room. Dark hair tied back low, a few loose strands catching the light around a face that would have been soft, if not for the watchfulness in it. She had the posture of someone who had learned that hesitation invites trouble. Nobody spoke. The warmth from inside touched Silas's face. So did the smell of bread and wood smoke and tea. It hit him with such cruel familiarity that for a second he was no longer a man on a porch in Idaho, but a son at 17, too tall for the doorway, hearing his mother move around the kitchen before dawn. Then the younger woman took one step forward. "Can I help you?" Her voice was not rude. That would have been simpler. It was guarded, sharpened by necessity, and all the more difficult because it belonged in this house too easily. Silas looked past her shoulder without meaning to. The table had been scrubbed. A folded dish towel rested by the sink. Fire glowed somewhere deeper in the house. A pair of women's boots stood drying on a mat near the wall. There were signs of use everywhere, but not carelessness. Care. He dragged his gaze back to her. "This is Reed Farm." The older woman's fingers tightened once around the edge of the door. "It is," she said carefully. Silas reached inside his jacket and felt both women tense before he even touched the papers. Not fear, exactly. Readiness. He drew out the folder slowly and unfolded the top sheet. "My name is Silas Reed." His voice sounded rougher than he intended. "This land belongs to me." The words should have landed with force. He was the one with the right, the name, the legal claim, the old blood in the soil if a person still believed in such things. But standing there with snow melting dark around his boots while warm air poured past them from his own kitchen, he heard how strange the sentence really was. Belongs. The younger woman's eyes changed first. Not into guilt, into anger. Not the loud kind. The old, exhausted kind that had already survived worse things than confrontation. She looked at the paper, then at him, then beyond him toward the truck and the road, and 15 absent years packed silently behind both. "If you're Reed," she said, "then this place waited a long time." The older woman turned slightly. "May." But May did not take it back. She stood with her chin level, one hand still wet from whatever she had been doing at the sink, and held his gaze with an honesty so clean it left no room for easy indignation. Something in Silas flared. Defensiveness, maybe, or the last reflex of a man who had spent years answering no questions because no one had earned the right to ask them. But the answer never made it to his mouth, because she was right in at least one way that mattered. Behind him, Mako stepped closer to the threshold, then stopped. He lifted his head once, taking in the room, the women, the heat, the scent of flour and ash and old wood brought back to life. His tail stayed still. Then, with the strange solemnity dogs sometimes carry better than people, he sat down on the porch as if he had arrived at a place that required quiet. That small gesture broke something open in Silas far more effectively than accusation had. He had known Mako long enough to trust the dog's silences. Mako disliked chaos. He distrusted sharp movements, false cheer, men who smiled too fast, places where fear had soaked deep into walls. Yet here he sat, alert but untroubled, one ear tipped, amber eyes steady on the women as if measuring not threat but sorrow. Silas looked again. Not intruders. Not in the clean, criminal sense of the word. The older woman had flour on her sleeve and a mending needle stuck through the collar of her apron. May's knuckles were red from cold water, the skin across them cracked from work. On the table behind them sat 3 jars of something preserved in amber light. On the windowsill over the sink were 2 small pots with herbs trying to live through winter. His first clear feeling was not outrage. It was disorientation so complete it bordered on grief. He had spent 15 years imagining this place as frozen at the moment he failed it, rotting exactly where he left it. Loyal, in some twisted way, to his absence, but the house had not remained faithful to neglect. Someone had kept it breathing, and that, more than trespass, more than anger, more than the bureaucratic threat waiting in the county seat 2 days from now, was what shook him. The terrible, humbling fact that while he had been reducing his life to roads and exits and motel lamps, this old house had gone on reaching toward warmth in the hands of strangers. Silas lowered the papers a fraction. No one moved. Snow ticked lightly from the porch roof. Somewhere inside, the oven gave a soft, settling sound. The farmhouse stood around them, no longer dead, no longer his in any simple way, and very much not the ruin he had come prepared to face. For the first time since turning into the drive, Silas understood that the hardest part of coming home might not be what had been lost. It might be seeing what had been loved without him. Silas did not leave. That fact sat in the kitchen before he did, awkward and undeniable as a wet coat hung over the back of a chair. Nora Bell stepped aside first, though not in surrender. It was the movement of an older woman who understood weather, timing, and when a threshold had stopped being just wood under a door. May hesitated half a second longer, her hand still resting against the edge of the table as if she could steady the whole room through it. Then she moved too. Silas came in with the cold still clinging to him. The warmth of the farmhouse struck him harder inside than it had from the porch. Wood smoke, bread, damp wool drying by the stove, the faint, clean bitterness of tea leaves left too long in hot water. None of it belonged to the house he had frozen in memory. The kitchen of his childhood had been orderly in a way this one was not. His mother had favored polished counters, bowls nested by size, aprons folded twice before hanging. This room was alive differently. There were repairs everywhere that did not match, but held. A chipped crock near the sink filled with wooden spoons. A crate turned into a shelf for jars. A towel mended at the edge with careful blue thread. It should have felt like intrusion. Instead, it felt like a truth he had no right to interrupt too quickly. Mako crossed the doorway without hesitation and paused beside the stove. He looked once at Nora, once at May, then lowered himself onto the braided rug with his front paws crossed. It was an old, formal posture, almost absurdly composed. May noticed it and said nothing, but some of the steel in her shoulders eased by a degree too small to call relief. Nora removed the loaf from the oven with bare competence, setting it on a folded towel. "You may as well sit," she said. "Standing doesn't make anything simpler." Her voice was gentle without being soft. She was a small woman, but up close Silas could see the kind of strength age leaves behind when it takes almost everything else. Rope-veined hands, a back that no longer straightened fully, eyes pale and watchful as frost over creek water. Flour dusted one sleeve of her cardigan. Silas set the folded county papers on the table but did not sit immediately. "How long have you been here?" May answered before Nora could. "Long enough to keep the pipes from bursting." The edge in her voice was different now, less defensive, more tired. Silas finally took the chair nearest the door, not the one at the head of the table, not his father's old place. He did that without thinking, and when he noticed it, he disliked what it suggested. He peeled off his gloves and looked at the red cracks across May's knuckles as she poured tea into a mismatched mug and pushed it toward him. It was not generosity, exactly. It was what decent people did in winter, even in the middle of a standoff. "I asked how long," he said. "Since last February," Nora replied. That made him look up. Almost a year. May sat across from him, but not fully at ease in the chair. She perched forward, as if ready to stand again if the conversation turned the wrong way. In better circumstances, Silas thought, she might have been striking. Not because she arranged herself to be seen, but because she clearly had never spent energy trying to soften the fact of herself. Dark hair pulled back low, strong, tired face, eyes the color of dark tea, sharp enough to make a person aware of what they were avoiding. "We didn't come into the house first," Nora said. "Not at the beginning." Silas said nothing, and perhaps because silence had become the only room large enough for the truth, she went on. "There had been a storm last winter, one of those long northern storms that did not fall dramatically all at once but kept returning, patient as debt. They had already lost their apartment by then. The landlord had waited exactly long enough after her husband's death to stop pretending compassion was possible. Nora and May had packed what they could carry and left behind what grief had already made useless. Nora had remembered the east greenhouse of Reed Farm, not the house, the greenhouse and the old storage shed attached to it. Years ago, before Silas left, before his mother died, Nora had worked one autumn season at the orchard. Sorting fruit, tying branches, helping with canning when the harvest overran the daylight. One bitter winter, after a freeze came early, Silas's mother had handed her a ring of keys and told her that if the roads closed, the greenhouse stove and the root cellar could keep a person alive. "I remembered that," Nora said quietly. "Not because I was looking to steal a place, because I was looking for one corner of the world that might not let my daughter freeze." May stared into her cup. Her jaw tightened, though whether from embarrassment or memory he could not tell. "We only meant to stay 3 nights, she said. "Maybe 4. The greenhouse, she told him, had still been half standing then. The plastic cracked, one panel of glass gone. The little oil stove choked with dust, but workable after she cleaned the line. The rain barrel had frozen solid the first night and thawed enough by noon for them to break water loose with a hammer. They slept in their coats with feed sacks under the blankets because cold rose through the cot frames like another body." Silas listened and kept his face blank from long practice, but inside, shame moved through him with slow, deliberate teeth. He had pictured absence as empty. He had not pictured someone else learning the house in winter because there was nowhere else left to go. "The apartment?" he asked. May let out a short breath that held no humor. "Gone." Nora folded her hands around the tea mug as though warming old bones was a separate profession. "My husband was hurt at the mill. Years ago. He was never the same after. Bed for the last 4 years. Then worse than bed. May left work to care for him." Silas glanced at her. She looked back without apology. "Library assistant. Not much money, but it was ours. Then it wasn't." The rest came in fragments, the way real hardship often does, not as a single melodramatic collapse, but as the steady removal of one support after another. Medical bills, medication, a short-term bridge loan sold to them by men who used words like manageable and temporary while writing numbers that fed on desperation. Jewelry sold first, then furniture, then the second car, then the chance to pretend any of it was reversible. When Nora's husband died, he took the last thin thread of legal patience with him. The landlord wanted them out. The debt company wanted signatures. Sympathy from neighbors shrank as soon as it became inconvenient. May did not cry while she spoke. That moved Silas more than tears might have. Instead, she described practical things: which utensils they kept, what they sold, how many blankets were worth carrying versus how many would only slow them down, the order in which a life gets reduced when there is no audience for the tragedy. By the time she finished, the bread had cooled enough to cut. Nora sliced it with a serrated knife whose handle had been repaired with twine. She put a piece on a plate and slid it toward Silas out of old instinct, perhaps forgetting for a moment that this conversation did not belong to ordinary hospitality. He looked at the bread and thought of his mother's hands. Then of May crouched over a greenhouse stove last winter, learning how to keep flame in a place he had abandoned. About halfway through the loaf, something in the room changed. Not because anybody forgave anybody, not because the truth had made things simple, but because Mako rose from the rug, crossed to Nora, and laid his heavy head lightly against her knee. Nora went still. So did May. The dog did not seek attention often, and never indiscriminately. He was courteous with strangers, skeptical with men who talked too loudly, openly cold to those whose anger smelled like action. Yet now he leaned against Nora as if he had decided, in the private tribunal of animals, that she belonged to the category of the tired and harmless. Nora's hand hovered over his head before settling into the fur between his ears. "Well," she murmured, voice thinner than before, "aren't you the first sensible thing to happen all day?" May laughed. It escaped her by surprise, brief and soft, and immediately regretted, as if laughter itself had become a luxury item she had forgotten she could afford. But once it was out, the room could not go back to exactly what it had been. Silas looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just a guarded woman occupying his house, but a person who had been carrying too much weight for too long and had learned to shape her whole body around bracing for impact. He set both palms flat against the table. "Why move into the main house?" May wiped the smile away too quickly. "Because the greenhouse nearly killed us." Nora gave the answer more fully. The cold had deepened. A seam in the roof had opened. Water found its way through, then ice, then wind. They stayed longer than they should have out of pride and fear both, but by late spring it became obvious the outbuilding would not hold through another storm. The farmhouse had been unlocked by then, its back latch barely functioning. Dusty, yes. Neglected, yes. But sound enough in the bones to save. So they cleaned one room, then another. Not all at once. Not as conquerors, as people too tired to die politely. Silas let the information settle in him. He did not feel noble for hearing it. He did not feel merciful. Mostly he felt displaced. Not from ownership, but from moral ground. Every explanation they gave pressed against the same bruised place. While he had been gone constructing a life of motion and avoidance, these two women had learned his family home by survival. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to thin into silver. Snow at the window reflected the kitchen back at itself. Somewhere in the wall, a pipe clicked. Silas finally took a bite of the bread. It was still warm at the center. Not his mother's recipe. Different flour, denser crumb, less salt, but real. Made here. Today. He chewed and swallowed before asking, "If you thought the place was abandoned, why stay nervous every time a truck came up the drive?" That was the question that changed May's face. Her fingers tightened around the mug. The rawness returned to her posture, but now it carried something beyond pride. Nora looked toward her daughter without speaking. May stared past Silas for a moment, out the darkening window where the orchard rose blurred into white and gray. When she spoke again, the words were flatter than before, stripped of everything except usefulness. "Because there's a man," she said, "and he doesn't need the sheriff to make people leave." Silas waited. Her throat moved once. "His name is Gideon Voss." The kitchen seemed to draw inward around the name, as if even the walls recognized it. "He's come before," May continued. "Never loud. Never enough for anyone official to bother with. Just enough to remind us we're temporary." Silas did not yet know the man, but he knew the type at once. The ones who preferred pressure over spectacle. Men who let fear do their labor for them. May's eyes lifted back to his. "If you're really staying long enough to decide what this place is," she said, "then you should know poverty isn't the worst thing that's found us here." Silas looked at Nora, at the repaired kitchen, at Mako still leaning calmly against the older woman's leg, and understood that whatever waited beyond this table had already been living in the margins of the house before he arrived. But that was for later. For now there were still 3 cups on the table, bread cooling between them, and the hard, unfinished fact that he had not told them to leave. Silas left before sunrise. The farmhouse was still half asleep when he stepped onto the porch, the cold blue of early morning turning the orchard rows into lines of shadow and frost. The sky had not fully decided whether it meant to brighten. Smoke moved thinly from the chimney behind him. Somewhere inside, floorboards gave one soft complaint, then settled again. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, not because he wanted to stay. He had learned long ago to distrust that kind of feeling, but because the house no longer felt vacant in the way he had spent years imagining. It had rhythms now that were not his. A kettle set out before dawn, a boot tray near the door that had been emptied and wiped, a dish towel hung to dry over a chair. Small signs of ordinary life. They should have made leaving easier. Instead, they made him aware of absence in a new way. Mako waited beside the truck, breath ghosting in the dark. The dog's coat caught what little light there was, black across the back and shoulders, amber brown around the throat and chest, the pale dusting around his muzzle making him look older in the morning cold. He jumped into the passenger seat without being told. Silas drove into town with the county papers on the seat between them and May's last words from the night before still lodged under his ribs. "There's a man, and he doesn't need the sheriff to make people leave." Daylight came slowly over the valley. Northern Idaho in winter did not reveal itself all at once. It lifted in layers. First the treetops, then the fences, then the roofs of low buildings clustered along the road ahead. The town had not changed enough to feel strange, and that was its own form of accusation. The same grain elevator stood off to one side, weathered to the color of old bone. The feed store still had a hand-painted sign over the porch, though the lettering was newer. The church steeple looked shorter than he remembered, which usually meant he had grown older rather than the steeple smaller. He parked near the post office first. The community board outside was crowded with notices curling at the edges under the glass. Hay for sale, a quilting circle, chainsaw sharpening, one flyer for a winter fundraiser taped over another. A woman in a red knit hat came out holding 3 parcels and stopped short when she saw him. Not dramatically, just enough for recognition to pass between them and Hardin. "You're a Reed," she said. Silas had no idea who she was. She corrected herself before he could answer. Or maybe still are. Hard to tell. Then she moved on, not rude, not friendly, simply unwilling to help him pretend that time had erased his name from other people's mouths. That became the morning's pattern. At the dry goods counter, the man weighing cracked corn for a farmer Two customers ahead took one look at Silas and turned thoughtful in a way that was almost worse than hostility. At the gas station, a teenager bagging snacks stared openly at Mako and asked whether the dog bit. At the edge of the hardware aisle, two older men lowered their voices without lowering them enough. Silas had spent years living anonymously, and anonymity had begun to feel like neutrality. Here, he was reminded that not being present did not mean not being remembered. Sometimes it meant being remembered in the shape of a wound. He found Iris Dalton 2 doors down from the county office in a narrow brick building that had once housed a dentist and now held, according to the brass plate by the door, a title service, notary office, and legal records desk. Inside, it smelled of paper, old radiator heat, and furniture polish that had long ago stopped masking the age of the place. Iris sat behind a scarred oak desk under a hanging lamp with a yellowed glass shade. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with silver threading through dark hair cut to the jaw in a way that seemed practical rather than fashionable. Her face was sharp without being severe, the kind of face that had likely frightened sloppy men for decades. She wore a charcoal cardigan over a dark blouse and half-moon reading glasses low on her nose. When she looked up and saw Silas, her expression did not change much. That, more than warmth would have, made him think she was trustworthy. "You came," she said. "I got your letter." "I sent 3. He took the chair across from her desk. Mako lay down near the radiator with the sigh of a dog resigned to paperwork. Iris held out her hand. "Show me what you brought." Silas passed her the county notice, the older deed papers he had found in the truck's glove compartment, and 2 envelopes he had not opened until the night before. She sorted them quickly, fingers dry and precise, not wasting any motion. Outside, someone went by dragging a shovel over concrete. Inside, only the turning of paper and the radiator's knocking filled the room. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked directly at him. "The good news," she said, "is that nobody's trying to take the house itself. Not yet." Silas leaned back. "That's your good news? It should tell you this isn't about sentiment." Iris slid one document free and tapped a paragraph with her finger. "The orchard's classification matters. If Reed Farm is considered non-operational, the county can approve a revised winter access easement and broader utility accommodation on the north edge. Public benefit, regional use, development efficiency, those kinds of pretty phrases." Silas had heard enough briefing language in his life to know when words were built to hide a knife. "And who's asking for that?" Iris gave him a look that suggested he already knew. "Gideon Voss Development Group, fronted through 2 separate land holdings and a transport concern. Cleaner on paper that way." Silas said nothing. She continued. "He doesn't need your porch. He doesn't need your kitchen table. What he wants is what sits under the land and what can cross it. Reliable agricultural water, seasonal road linkage, contiguous reach to the slope behind your property." "The ridge line?" She nodded. "He's been buying quietly up there." "For what?" Iris leaned back, the chair giving a faint creak. "Depends which version you want. Officially, a phased winter lodge and outdoor recreation project. Less officially, timber movement, private access, speculative resale once the roadwork is in place." She paused. "Men like Gideon don't buy hills for the view, unless there's a way to monetize the snow." Silas looked at the papers again. The words themselves were dull. Utility, access, reclassification. Nothing in them resembled theft. That was the elegance of it. "If the house is occupied," he said slowly, If the orchard is active, then it gets harder, Iris finished. Harder to argue that the land's dormant. Harder to split its functional identity away from the people using it. Harder to dress private gain as regional necessity. Silas thought of Nora's mended apron, May's cracked hands, smoke from the chimney, bread cooling on his family table. Not squatters, evidence. That realization unsettled him in a different way than the night before. Iris must have seen some version of it pass through his face, because her voice softened. Not much. Just enough to let him know softness existed under the edges. You don't have to decide everything this week, but you do need to understand the shape of what's being done. And Voss? She replaced her glasses. He's polite. That's what makes him expensive. Silas almost smiled. Almost. When he left her office, the town had fully woken. Snowmelt dripped from eaves into shallow slush at the curb. He crossed the street to the garage with Mako at his side. Ben Harrow's place looked exactly like the kind of shop that had survived because its owner no longer cared whether survival looked graceful. The sign over the bay door hung a little crooked. One truck on blocks waited out front under a tarp held down with chain. Inside, the air was thick with oil, cold metal, and burned coffee. Wrenches hung on a pegboard in outlines darker than the wall behind them. Ben was under the hood of a pickup when Silas came in. He backed out on a wheeled creeper, pushing with one boot, and for a second, he looked like a man assembled from spare parts left over from harsher decades. Broad across the shoulders, despite age, gray beard cut close, one eye slightly narrower than the other from an old break or old suspicion. He wore a quilted work vest over flannel and carried his age the way some men carried tools, openly, with no apology. He took in Silas, the dog, the pause between them. "Well," he said, "look what the mountain coughed back." Silas remembered him then. Ben had fixed the combine twice in one summer and argued with Silas's father every single time over cost, weather, and whether the problem had been obvious to anyone with a functioning brain. As a boy, Silas had liked him because Ben treated him as if he were capable of learning, which in rural communities often masqueraded as meanness. "Morning, Ben." Ben wiped his hands on a rag that only rearranged the grease. "Depends who you ask." Silas told him he needed the truck checked, maybe a look at the orchard generator later if he decided to keep using it. Ben listened without expression, then asked the first question that mattered. "You staying?" "I'm here for the hearing." That wasn't the question. Silas let that pass. Ben walked a slow circle around the truck, more to think than to inspect. "You've got company out there," he said at last. Silas went still. "You know about that. Town's small. People with spare time notice chimneys." He crouched near the front tire, pressed a thumb to the tread, stood again. "Those women aren't the problem." Silas looked at him. "No?" Ben snorted softly, like a man offended by obviousness. If a place is standing after this many winters, the people carrying wood into it usually aren't the enemy. That sentence followed Silas all afternoon. He stopped at the feed store, bought chicken feed he didn't actually know whether they needed. Picked up pipe wrap, kerosene, and 2 boxes of nails he might have passed over anywhere else but here, because buying supplies in his own name felt like a form of testimony he wasn't yet ready to examine. At each stop, Gideon Voss became more defined without appearing. Not through drama, through subtraction. A woman at the grain counter mentioned, too casually, that some suppliers had become careful about extending credit to people out on reed land. A man near the fuel pump said Voss had been generous with the church roof fund last fall. Another observed that Gideon was trying to bring business in, the way people did when they wanted to avoid saying whose business was being moved out. By the time Silas drove back toward the farm, he understood the method. No smashed windows, no overt threats, no sheriff leaning on the porch rail, just a net drawn tighter, one decent-looking knot at a time. Make life a little less possible, a little less connected. Remove favors, remove patience. Remove the soft places where human beings survive. He had seen campaigns built like that before, in countries most people in this valley could not find on a map. Not identical, nothing ever was, but familiar in structure. You did not have to win by force if you could teach people that staying would cost more than leaving. At the farmhouse, May met him outside before he had fully unloaded the truck. She came down the porch steps in her slate-colored jacket, dark hair escaping its tie in the wind, eyes narrowing slightly at the sacks in the truck bed. "You bought too much feed. You have chickens?" "6, and that's still too much." Silas glanced toward the coop and saw that she was right. "Then it'll keep." May looked at the hardware supplies, the kerosene, the wrapped insulation, and her expression changed. Not softened exactly, but recalculated. "You went to town." "I did." "And?" He shut the truck door harder than he meant to. "And your Gideon Voss doesn't want the house." May's face did not show surprise, only a quiet kind of bitterness. "No. He wants the parts no one photographs." Silas leaned one arm on the truck bed. "You could have led with that. You looked like a man still trying to decide whether we were thieves." Her voice was level, but not unkind. "I didn't think legal strategy was the first bridge to build." He let out a breath through his nose. "Fair enough." The cold deepened as the light lowered. Together, without discussing how strange it was, they carried the supplies toward the porch. May lifted one of the heavier bags before he could reach for it. Silas took it from her anyway. Their hands touched briefly on the burlap seam. Hers were cold, rough from work. Neither of them commented. Halfway to the house, Mako stopped and turned toward the road. Not barking, not tense, just alert. Silas followed the dog's gaze. Far down beyond the line of trees where the drive curved out toward the county road, a dark SUV sat motionless for the space of 3 breaths. Then it rolled on. May had seen it too. He knew because the bag in her arms tightened against her body. Was that him? "No," she said after a moment. "Not his car." Then quieter. "But close enough." They carried the rest inside. After supper, simple stew, silence, the sound of Nora mending something by the lamp. Silas went back out to the truck for the last box. He found Ben Harrow waiting by the gate as if he had risen out of the snow itself. The old mechanic stood with his hat pulled low, hands sunk in his vest pockets, truck idling at the road behind him. Silas walked down the path. "Lose your way?" Ben ignored that. He jerked his chin toward the farmhouse where warm light glowed behind the curtains. "Looks different with people in it." "It does." Ben studied him in the dark, the way old men do when deciding whether truth would be wasted. "You know what your problem is, Reed?" Silas almost laughed. "You'll tell me regardless." "Damn right." Ben's voice held no malice now, only weathered impatience. This land didn't start dying because bad men wanted pieces of it. Bad men always want pieces of something. He took one step back toward his truck, then stopped and delivered the sentence like a tool placed hard on wood. It started dying because its own people left. Ben got in and drove off before Silas answered. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the stove had settled into its low iron ticking, Silas lay awake in the room that had once been his and stared at the unfamiliar shadows cast by curtains someone else had washed. He had spent years blaming distance for what distance had ruined. Now, with Ben's words lodged in him like a splinter too deep to pull, he saw the harder shape of it. Land did not remain loyal simply because memory said it should. It survived, or it didn't, according to who kept showing up for it. And somewhere below that thought, more dangerous still, another one waited. For the first time in a long while, he was no longer certain he had come back only to leave. The power went out just after dusk. There was no dramatic crack, no burst of sparks, only a brief dimming of the kitchen light, and then a clean surrender to darkness. For a second, the farmhouse held its breath. The refrigerator stopped humming. The old clock over the stove fell silent. Somewhere deeper in the walls, the absence of electricity became a sound of its own. Then Nora struck a match. The flare lit her face from below, softening nothing. It only made her look older and steadier at once. She cupped the flame with one hand and brought it to the oil lamp on the table. May lit another from that one, then another, and soon the kitchen and sitting room were stitched together by small circles of amber light that left the corners in shadow. Outside, wind moved along the house in long, cold palms, rattling something loose near the eaves. Silas rose automatically. "I'll check the line." May looked toward the window. Snow had begun again. Not hard, but fine and restless, turning the glass into a shifting gray veil. "You won't see much out there. I'm not checking to admire the view." It was the driest thing he had said all day, and to his faint surprise, Nora smiled. The farmhouse had shrunk since sunset. Without the low conveniences of electricity, the rooms seemed older, more honest. The stove gave off a deep iron warmth. The lamp flame breathed. Mako stretched out near the hearth, not asleep but settled, his large body lying across the worn rug in a diagonal line that somehow made the room feel guarded. The dog's tipped ear twitched whenever the wind struck the house a certain way. Silas pulled on his field jacket and gloves and stepped out through the mudroom. The cold met him with immediate authority. The yard was a blurred white half-world under the storm, the orchard rows fading into weather before they reached the back fence. The generator shed stood dark. The wrapped pipes near the greenhouse had held for now, but the north sideline would need checking if the temperature dropped much further. He moved by habit, flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the snowfall. His boots broke crusted snow with a hard, familiar sound. The place should have felt empty in weather like this. Instead, it felt inhabited even in darkness. Someone had stacked split wood neatly under the lean-to. Someone had set the shovel blade down against the side wall so it wouldn't gather ice in the scoop. Someone had hung old feed sacks over the gap beneath the mudroom door to keep drafts from crawling in. That someone was not him. He checked the utility box, followed the line by flashlight, found a connection at the side post glazed in ice but not broken. The storm had likely taken the main line farther down the road. Nothing he could fix tonight. When he turned back toward the house, the beam caught a loose strip of tin fastened near the woodshed roof. Wind knocked it sharply against a post. Metal on wood. Irregular. Hollow. His body reacted before his mind did. In an instant, the dark yard was no longer Idaho. The flashlight felt wrong in his hand. Too small. Too civilian. The sound came again. Tin, wood, wind, and his chest clenched so hard his breath stopped halfway. The snow became dust in another country. Night flattened into angles and noise and waiting. He was no longer a man standing 10 yards from a farmhouse. He was inside a memory with no clean exit. He dropped the beam. The light spun wild across the snow and came to rest against the fence, tilted, useless. His vision narrowed. The cold disappeared. Then came the terrible opposite. Not sensation, but too much of it. Heart hammering too fast. Blood running loud in his ears. The old instinct to move and not move at once. To hit the ground. To scan, to disappear. To survive whatever was not here. A weight pressed against his leg. Not hard, just enough. Mako. The dog had come out without a sound. Silas didn't remember hearing the mudroom door open, but there Mako was, shoulder against his thigh, body warm and solid through the storm. Not tugging, not whining. Just there, insisting on present tense by force of contact alone. Silas shut his eyes, breathed in once and got only cold. Tried again. This time there was wet fur, snow, wood smoke clinging faintly to Mako's coat, the smell of the house still on him. Idaho, farm, night, not then. He got one breath down, then another. When he opened his eyes, the flashlight was still on its side in the snow, and the tin strip was still just tin. No enemy movement, no incoming fire, no voices, only weather and an old wound that had mistaken a sound for a door left open in time. May stood on the porch in Nora's wool shawl, one hand braced against the frame. She had not called his name. That, more than anything, kept the moment from breaking the wrong way. He picked up the flashlight, straightened slowly. Mako remained against him a moment longer, then stepped back once Silas had found his breath again. "The line's out past the property," he said, hearing the roughness in his own voice. May did not say, "I know what just happened." She only came down one step, the lamplight behind her tracing the edge of her hair and cheek in warm gold. "Then come inside before your pride freezes solid too." It was not kindness exactly. It was better than kindness. It was an exit with dignity left on it. Back in the house, Nora set a kettle on the stove, though she must have known nobody needed more tea. Some women, Silas thought, had spent so long surviving grief that they developed an instinct for giving people an ordinary task to hide behind until they could rejoin themselves. The three of them moved around the power outage the way strangers move around a shared table on the first day of a long journey. Not comfortably, but with increasing awareness of each other's silences. Later, when the kettle had hissed and settled and the wind found a harsher rhythm against the windows, they gathered in the sitting room. Nora mended by lamplight. May checked the wick on the second lamp, then sat in the armchair nearest the stove with a blanket across her knees she did not seem to notice. Silas took the straight-backed chair by the hearth. Mako lay across the space between him and the fire, like some old carved guardian from a colder century. For a while no one spoke. The storm made the house feel both smaller and truer. Without electric light, the room returned to proportions memory understood. His mother had once read in this exact corner in winter evenings. His father had fallen asleep in that other chair with the newspaper open over his chest. Silas had stood at the window as a boy and believed snow made the world gentler because it covered so much of it. Nora threaded a needle, missed, and tried again. "There's something I should have told you sooner," she said. May looked up. "Mama?" "No." Nora's voice was mild but final. "He has a right to this much." Silas felt himself go still. Nora laid the shirt she had been mending across her lap. In the lamplight, her hands looked almost translucent over the fabric, but when she folded them, the gesture held no frailty. "After your mother died," she said, "I came back here a few times." The room altered in one quiet, irreversible movement. Silas said nothing. Nora went on before he could interrupt, as if experience had taught her that some truths survive only if spoken in one breath. She had not come to save the farm, she said. Not the whole farm. That would have been a foolish thing for one woman with a bad knee, a sick husband at home, and not enough gas money for sentiment. She came back for a smaller reason than that, and because it was smaller, perhaps more human. There was a row of red apples near the greenhouse your mother favored, she said. Not the prettiest ones, the stubborn ones. She said they held through bad frost if you knew how to cut them back. Silas looked toward the dark window as if he could see them through the storm. Nora's eyes softened, but only around the memory, not herself. And the drying herbs behind the kitchen? Sage, mostly. A little thyme. She kept them because she said a house shouldn't smell like winter all year. A pause. There were also 2 window frames on the east side that took the worst of the ice. She hated hearing them rattle. The details hit him harder than any grand confession could have. Not property, not legacy. Herb beds, window frames, specific tendernesses. The private anatomy of a place his mother had touched so often that another woman had learned its weak points by heart. I couldn't bear the thought of all of it going quiet that way, Nora said. Not right after. May had gone very still in her chair. She was hearing this too, Silas realized, or at least hearing the full shape of it for the first time. So I came when I could. Late winter, mostly. Once in the fall, I cut back the apple row, covered what I could near the roots, boarded those windows better, swept out the little drying shed one year when the roof held. Nora gave a faint, humorless smile. Not enough to call it saving. Enough to keep a few things from dying for no reason. Silas's throat tightened. Did my father know? He asked. Nora lowered her eyes briefly. Yes. That answer hurt in a way he had not prepared for. He saw me here once, she said. Not the first year, maybe the second. He was embarrassed, I think. More than angry. A proud man can survive a great deal, but being helped in the place where he once provided for everyone, that's harder. She threaded the needle now without looking. He thanked me badly, which is to say he said almost nothing at all. Despite himself, Silas gave a short breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Nora heard it. Yes. Well, you come by some things honest. Silas stared into the stove. For years he had arranged the story in his own mind one way. He had left. The house had emptied. The land had waited in silent decline, and his guilt, though painful, had at least made a clean architecture of it. Now Nora had taken a hand and simply removed a wall. The place had not waited only in abandonment. It had been touched, however lightly, by other hands. It had been kept in fragments. Not by him. Not even by his father entirely. By this woman sitting under lamplight with a mending needle in her lap and tired kindness in the corners of her face. The moral ground beneath him shifted. He was not the only one with a claim made of memory. And worse, better, he was not even the person who had loved the place most faithfully in its weakest years. May spoke at last, her voice low. You never told me it was his mother's row. Nora shrugged one shoulder. It was still a row of trees. But Silas could hear in the old woman's tone what she did not say. And grief is grief, no matter who planted it. No one spoke for several minutes after that. The storm pressed harder at the walls. Somewhere upstairs, a board clicked with the changing temperature. Then May set the blanket aside and looked directly at Silas. There was no softness in her expression this time, but there was something more difficult than softness. Honesty without armor. I don't need saving, she said. He met her eyes. I know. No, she said, almost impatiently. I don't think you do. Men like you hear a story like ours and think the decent thing is to stay out of guilt, out of debt, out of trying to balance some invisible ledger. Her fingers closed around the arm of the chair. If you stay here, if you fight for this place, don't do it because you think you owe my mother and me shelter. Don't do it because you're ashamed of leaving. Shame makes people promise things they resent later. The words landed harder than accusation. Silas had been braced for blame from the day he arrived. He knew where to put blame. It fit in the old compartments. But this refusal to let him turn guilt into a form of generosity, left him unsteady. May went on, quieter now. If you stay, it has to be because you choose the place, not because you pity the people in it. The room seemed to narrow around the sentence. Silas looked at her, really looked, and understood that beneath the exhaustion, beneath the caution, this was the center of her. A woman who had paid too much for survival to be turned into an object of someone else's redemption. He pressed his thumb once against the edge of his jaw, an old habit returning before thought. You make that sound easy. I didn't say easy. Nora exhaled through her nose, not quite a sigh. Well, she murmured, that's cheerful. And absurdly, that line broke the tension just enough for all three of them to remain in the same room without anyone having to flee it. The knock came an hour later. Not at the front door, but at the mudroom entrance. 3 brisk taps, practical, unmistakably local. May rose first. Silas stood with her. Mako lifted his head, but did not get up. When Silas opened the door, Iris Dalton stood under the porch lamp in a dark coat dusted with snow, her gloved hand holding down a folder against the wind. She looked like a woman who had no time for weather or comfort when paperwork was moving in the wrong direction. Sorry for the hour, she said, which meant she was not sorry at all. I would have called if you had reliable service out here. Silas stepped aside. Something happened? Iris came in, removed one glove with her teeth and handed him the folder. The county hearing's been moved up. Day after tomorrow, 9 a.m. May, behind him, went still. Why? Silas asked, though he already knew the answer would have a name. Because Gideon Voss submitted supplemental operational review documents this afternoon. Iris's eyes moved briefly to May and Nora, then back to Silas. He's arguing Reed land no longer meets practical standards for sustained agricultural function. If the board accepts that framing, it strengthens everything else he wants. The house fell quiet around them. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, in the small lamp-lit room, the future shortened by 1 full day. Iris tapped the folder once. Read it tonight. We don't have the luxury of assuming common sense will show up on its own. When she left, she took some of the room's heat with her. Silas closed the door and stood with the folder in his hand. Nora had gone pale around the mouth, but said nothing. May folded her arms, not from cold. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Mako rose at last and crossed the room, not to Silas this time, but to the space between all three of them. He stood there, broad and steady in the lamplight, as if refusing to let the house break into separate corners again. Silas looked down at the folder, then at the women, then at the storm shaking the black windows. Nothing in him felt settled, but for the first time, uncertainty itself no longer felt like permission to leave. The next morning did not bring clarity. It brought work. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the farm under a hard, bright cold that made every sound carry farther than it should. The orchard stood in rows of white and dark bark, sharpened by sunlight. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, Ice clung to the north fence in dull blue ridges. The hearing now sat closer than any of them liked, and Gideon's papers had made one thing plain. Reed Farm could not survive on memory, indignation, or ownership alone. It would have to look alive because it was alive. Silas said that once, standing in the yard with Iris's folder in one hand and a pair of work gloves tucked under his arm. He did not mean it as a speech. May, who was breaking a crust of ice from the rain barrel with the back of a hatchet, glanced at him and gave the smallest nod. "Then stop talking like a man at a hearing," she said, "and help me move this barrel." That became the rhythm of the days that followed. Not dramatic, not noble, just exact. By mid-morning, the farm sounded different. Wood striking wood, hammer on bracket, the scrape of a ladder being dragged over packed snow, the dry rustle of feed being poured into buckets, Nora's cough from the porch when the wind turned wrong, Mako's nails clicking over old floorboards before disappearing outside again. Silas began with the shed behind the house, the one his father had always called the back storage, though it was really 3 different eras of bad decisions held together by patched siding and the stubbornness of rural men. The door stuck halfway and had to be shouldered open. Dust lifted in the shaft of winter light. The place smelled of old burlap, machine oil, mouse droppings, and cedar dry enough to remember summers. He had not been in there since he was a teenager. The shelves still held the remains of a life that had once assumed continuity. Bent apple crates, rusted pruning hooks, coffee tins filled with screws sorted by no system visible to anyone but his father, a cracked thermos, a box of receipts tied with twine. It would have been easy to turn sentimental in that kind of room, but work is often a mercy because it makes nostalgia carry its own weight. Silas started sorting. Keep, burn, repair, toss. By noon, he had uncovered a narrow wooden drawer jammed beneath a workbench. It resisted at first, then slid free with a groan and a rain of sawdust. Inside lay a weather-creased notebook, its cover warped at one corner, and beneath it a folded sheet of paper yellowed into softness. The notebook was his father's. Silas knew it before he opened it. The handwriting confirmed it, tight, blunt, slanted slightly forward, as though even the words were trying to finish before weather caught them. Notes on frost timing, pipe repairs, orchard yields from years Silas could not bear to count too carefully. 2 pages of measurements for greenhouse shelving, a recipe, strangely enough, for vinegar wash to keep mildew off storage bins. And tucked inside the back cover, flattened by years, was the folded paper. He took it into the light. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but clear. Property lines marked in pencil, water channels noted in ink. The shallow runoff ditch that filled first in thaw season. The drainage route cut behind the greenhouse decades ago and later forgotten by everyone except the ground itself. Most importantly, there was an old haul track sketched along the backside of the hill, a narrow service route once used to drag timber around the north rise without crossing the center of the orchard. Silas stood with the map in both hands and felt something in him sharpen, not triumph, not even relief. Recognition. Gideon's argument for a necessary new access line through the easiest section of Reed land was exactly what Iris had called it, elegant theft. There had already been another way around. Older, rougher, less convenient for a man who wanted speed and clean control, but real. It meant Gideon did not need the new route. He wanted the simplest one. The one that cut through the heart of what could still be restored. May found him there a few minutes later, carrying a bundle of salvaged greenhouse slats against her shoulder. "What did you find?" He showed her the map. She stepped closer without asking permission, close enough that he caught the clean, cold scent of air and wool and the faint sweetness of apples dried long ago into the grain of the shed. Her finger hovered just above the page, careful not to smudge. "This line here," she said. "Old haul track." Her eyes flicked up to his. So he's lying. Silas folded the map once, gently. "He's selecting." May gave a short breath that might have been anger or respect for precision. "Same thing. If you're the one getting pushed." They did not stand in the moment longer than necessary. That was part of the changing shape between them. Neither rushed to fill silence with meaning. Neither flinched from usefulness either. "Bring it inside," May said. "Then come help me with the greenhouse before I decide you're only good at finding paper." The greenhouse took the rest of the afternoon. It had once been modest and practical, built for extension rather than beauty. Time had reduced it to a structure with more courage than elegance. The south-facing side still caught light well, but 2 support beams had warped. 3 panes had been replaced with cloudy acrylic, and the rear benching leaned badly enough to shame anyone who had ever pretended a spirit level mattered. May worked like someone who had taught herself by necessity and improved through sheer repetition. No wasted motion, no theatrical struggling. She measured once, then again if wood had memory in it. She braced a frame with her hip while driving screws. She could lift more than people probably expected, and asked for help only when the task truly required a second set of hands. Silas noticed these things in the same unannounced way he noticed weather. Together, they rebuilt 2 shelving runs from salvaged boards and newer brackets Ben had forgotten to charge him for. May laid out shallow seed trays, spinach, winter lettuce, early herbs, a few starts that might make it to a market table if the weather stopped behaving like a grievance. Silas fixed the latch on the inner door, then the vent arm overhead. Mako moved in and out of the structure all day, inspecting their progress with the grave involvement of a foreman who never once lifted a tool. At one point, May passed Silas a tin of screws without looking, and he took it without needing to ask what size she meant. The gesture was small enough to vanish if either of them had named it. Instead, it stayed where many important things begin, in the body's quiet decision to trust a rhythm. By evening, the greenhouse looked less like a ruin being defended and more like an outbuilding with plans. Nora had spent the day in a different kind of restoration. The kitchen smelled of simmered fruit and warm spice by the time they came in. She stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in one hand and a notebook open near the sugar tin. Her handwriting was slower than Silas's father's had been, rounder with pauses built into it. But there was the same practical insistence underneath. "What's that?" Silas asked, stamping snow from his boots. "Your mother's apple preserve, or my best guess at it," Nora said. "Depends whether memory counts as a measurement." On the counter stood 3 jars cooling beside a rough pie crust waiting for its turn. Next to them lay a page headed in careful pencil, "Blue Winter Jam." Maybe too much clove last time. Silas looked at the page longer than he meant to. Nora noticed, of course. She noticed almost everything and chose mercy selectively. "I'm writing them down before I forget them properly," she said. "Forget whose?" "The recipes." She gave him a look over her shoulder. "Not the women." He almost smiled. Later that night, after supper, Iris arrived with typed forms and legal language folded into order. She spread them across the table and explained, in the clipped patience of someone translating a system she respected only in fragments, what they needed. Temporary occupancy statements, records of supply purchases, evidence of agricultural use, written affirmations of current repair work. declarations tied to seasonal production. May signed where she was told, but not passively. She asked questions. Which clause mattered? Which one could be turned later? Was temporary agricultural occupancy different from incidental residence? Iris answered everyone without condescension. Watching them, Silas understood something he had not before. Competence in women was often ignored until it became the only reason a place kept standing. Ben came the following day under the pretense of checking the old generator. He arrived in a truck that sounded like it had opinions about every hill it climbed and came wearing the same quilted vest, the same close gray beard, the same look of permanent dissatisfaction with lesser men and faulty equipment. He grumbled through the inspection, insulted the age of the machine, insulted the quality of the bolts that had last been used on it, then left behind a coil of insulated pipe wrap, a drive belt, and 2 brass fittings on the porch rail, as if they had fallen from his pockets by accident. May picked one up after he drove off. Friendly man. He'd be horrified to hear you say that, Silas replied. She looked at him then, and this time the smile did not surprise her. The house changed by increments, not into perfection, into pattern. Silas found he could tell which room May was in by sound alone. The quicker, lighter step when she crossed the kitchen. The pause before the mudroom door when she was balancing something heavy with her shoulder. The impatient double shift of chair legs when paperwork annoyed her. He began to expect Nora's lamp in the front window before dusk. Mako divided his loyalties without ceremony, following May into the orchard rows, waiting outside the cellar when Nora went down for jars, standing below the ladder with suspicious dignity when Silas climbed to patch a roof seam. No one discussed the arrangement. The farm simply began to breathe with all of them in it. One morning, while they were carrying seed trays into the greenhouse, May stopped in the doorway and let Silas pass before her, though her hands were full and his were not. He looked back. "You were closer," she said. It was nothing. It was not nothing. Another evening, Silas came in after dark from checking the north fence and found May no longer stiffening at the sound of his truck. She only lifted her head from the table, saw him, and went back to sorting seed packets with the calm of someone whose body had decided, before language did, that a certain return could be counted on. That frightened him more than he admitted. Trust, even partial trust, asks more of a man than solitude ever does. 3 nights before the hearing, the cold turned mean again. The sky had cleared to hard stars. The orchard shone under frost. The kind of cold that punished carelessness had settled over everything by full dark, and the secondary water line running toward the lower garden had to be checked before sleep. Silas took a flashlight and went out alone. The damage was quiet. That was the first thing. No shattered pipe. No dramatic destruction. No note nailed to a post. Just a section of the outer line near the garden beds where the insulation wrap had been cut cleanly away, and the exposed pipe twisted at the coupling hard enough to crack it once the temperature dropped. Silas crouched in the snow and touched the split metal with gloved fingers. Deliberate. Not the weather, not age, not bad luck. He stood slowly and swept the flashlight beam over the fence, the garden stakes, the gate latch. Nothing else disturbed except one shallow print near the side path that the wind had already begun to soften. When he came back to the house with the broken coupling in his hand, May was still awake at the table. Nora had gone to bed. Mako lifted his head from the hearth before rising. May looked from Silas's face to the metal piece in his palm and understood at once. What happened? He set it down on the table between them. She did not touch it immediately. Her jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, as if anger and fatigue were negotiating. "He started sooner than I thought," she said. Silas leaned both hands on the back of a chair, feeling something colder than the night settle into him. "This won't get a deputy out here." "No." May's voice was steady in a way that made the steadiness itself painful. "That's why men like him do things this size." Mako moved to her side first, then to his, as if unable to decide which human required guarding more. For a moment, all three of them looked at the broken piece of pipe under the hanging kitchen light. Such a small thing. Cheap metal. Replaceable. Almost laughably minor if taken alone. But that was the point, and each of them knew it. The farm had been warned. Not loudly. Not enough for law. Enough for fear. Silas straightened. May looked up at him, and there was no plea in her face, no request to be saved, only the exhausted clarity of someone who had seen this method before and hated how well it worked. The house around them remained warm. The greenhouse held its rows of dark soil waiting on morning. Nora slept down the hall. On the stove, tomorrow's stock cooled in a pot, with the lid tilted sideways. Everything ordinary remained, and because it remained, the threat felt more intimate, not less. Silas picked up the broken coupling once more, heavier now in meaning than in weight. Across from him, May did not look away. Neither of them said Gideon Voss's name. They did not have to. The storm announced itself before it arrived. All afternoon, the air had carried that metallic stillness northern winters sometimes wore before they turned violent. By dusk, the sky had lowered into a flat white lid over the valley. Sound changed first. The orchard no longer rustled. The road beyond the gate seemed to vanish into silence. Even the chickens quieted early, their small bodies huddled into themselves inside the coop as if they felt the pressure coming through the boards. Inside the farmhouse, the lamps were on before dark. May had moved the seed trays deeper into the greenhouse and covered the youngest starts with old frost cloth. Silas checked the wrapped pipes twice, then once more for reasons that had less to do with plumbing than with the illusion of control. Nora sat at the kitchen table with her cardigan buttoned all the way up, writing labels for the jars she and May had finished that week. Her hands looked thinner in the lamplight than they had a few days before, though her back stayed straight from habit. Mako had been restless since noon, not agitated, not pacing, just present in a more deliberate way than usual. He moved from room to room as if counting them. He checked the mudroom, the kitchen, the front hall, then returned to wherever Nora had settled. Once, when she rose too quickly from the table, he stood at once, ears tipped forward, and watched until she regained her balance. Silas noticed. "So do I," Nora said without looking up. He frowned. "What?" "The dog disapproves of my lungs." May lifted a kettle from the stove and gave her mother a look too practiced to be casual. "You've been coughing all day." "It's winter in Idaho," Nora replied. "My lungs are allowed an opinion." Silas said nothing, but some quiet part of him filed the exchange away. By 7, the wind had begun. Not steady at first, just long gusts feeling along the house, testing seams and edges, finding the old places in the siding that remembered earlier winters. Snow came with it by degrees, fine as sifted flour at the start, then thicker. The porch light turned into a blurred halo beyond the glass. At 8, the first flicker ran through the kitchen. May and Silas both looked up. The second flicker lasted longer. Then the light returned, thin and weak. "Generator?" May asked. "Not yet," Silas said. "If the line holds, we wait." It was a practical answer, but his own voice sounded tight to him. The memory of the last outage had not left his body entirely, only gone underground. Iris's folder sat in a neat stack near the bread box, pages marked, signed, clipped, ready for the hearing. Tomorrow morning, if the road remained passable, he meant to take them into town before dawn. He looked at the folder once, then away. The lights failed 5 minutes later. This time the house did not pause in surprise. They had already set lamps out. May lit them in quick sequence, moving through the dark with the assurance of someone who had lived too long among fragile systems to rely on any of them. The farmhouse contracted around firelight, stove heat, and the measured noise of weather building outside. Silas pulled on his jacket. "I'm starting the generator." "I'll come with you," May said. "No." It came out too fast. She stood still, one match held between finger and thumb. "No, because it's dangerous, or no, because you're planning to do all the deciding again?" The question landed cleanly. No accusation in it, just refusal. Silas held her gaze a second longer than he intended. "No, because one of us should stay with Nora." May opened her mouth, then shut it again. She knew he was right. That did not make surrendering the point any easier. "Take the storm lamp," she said. Outside, the cold had sharpened into something with teeth. Wind hit him broadside the moment he opened the mudroom door. Snow drove low and fast across the yard, flattening tracks almost as soon as they formed. The generator shed crouched near the side fence under a loading of white. Mako came with him uninvited, shoulders pushing through the storm like a darker piece of weather. The engine took 3 tries to catch. When it did, the sound felt almost intimate. Ugly, mechanical, alive. The line to the house jerked, steadied, and a weak glow returned to the windows. Silas checked the fuel level, the cover, the extension to the greenhouse line. Snow hit his face in stinging bursts. When he straightened, the beam of his lamp swung down the drive by accident. At the far end, barely more than a smear in the storm, a pair of headlights appeared. They did not approach. They simply sat there, dim through the snow, then blinked out. Silas held the lamp still and looked for movement. None. Just the invisible pressure of being observed. Not provable, not useful to report. Exactly the size of menace a man like Gideon favored. Mako gave one low sound in his throat. Not a bark, only recognition. Silas exhaled through his nose. "Yeah," he muttered. "I see it." By the time he returned to the house, wind had built into a constant force. May met him in the kitchen, lamp in one hand, wool scarf half fallen at her throat. "There's light. For now." "And?" He set the empty fuel can near the door. "Someone's sitting at the end of the drive." Her face changed, but not theatrically. Fear did not arrive new for May. It arrived like an old debt showing up again. "Can you tell who?" "No." She nodded once. That's how he likes it. Before Silas could answer, Nora coughed from the table. Not the ordinary winter cough from earlier. This one caught deeper, tore longer, left her bent slightly forward with one hand pressed under her ribs, as if trying to keep her own body from betraying her. Mako crossed the room before either of them did and stood close against her chair, head lifted, eyes fixed on her face. May was already there. "Mama?" "I'm fine," Nora managed, which had become, in older people, one of the least reliable phrases in the language. She was not fine. The color around her mouth had gone pale. Her breathing came shallower than it should have, each inhale seeming to bargain with the next one. May knelt beside her, the lamp making gold of the worry in her face. All the hard edges Silas had come to know in her were still there, but something raw moved underneath them now. Silas looked toward the back window where, beyond the darkness, the greenhouse waited with all their small beginnings inside it. He looked at the folder on the counter. He looked at the mudroom, the storm, the line of white swallowing the yard. Then he looked back at Nora. The decision happened so quickly, it left no room for the old reflex, the one that tried to hold every perimeter at once and called that strength. "Nora first," he said. May looked up. He was already moving. "Get the blankets from the front room. Build the heat up in here. I'll close the sitting room doors and keep the warmth in one side of the house. The greenhouse can wait 10 minutes. The sentence changed something. He heard it in the silence after. May rose without arguing, not because she suddenly became obedient, but because for the first time she believed he had placed the living in the right order. They worked quickly. Blankets, kettle, a second pot of water set near the stove for steam. The old inhaler Nora admitted she still kept, though she disliked using it because it made her hands shake. May rubbed her mother's back in slow circles, her own breath turning uneven despite her efforts to steady it. Silas shut doors, blocked the draft at the hallway base with rolled towels, fed the stove, then went to the phone by the wall and swore softly at the deadline. Cell service came and went in the storm. The first call to Ben dropped before it connected. The second held. "You awake?" Silas shouted over the wind noise in the line. Ben's voice came back thick with static and annoyance. "At my age, I wake up for weather out of spite. I need the tow generator. Now." A pause. "Farm?" "Yes." "How bad?" Silas looked across the kitchen at Nora struggling for breath and did not waste either of them with pride. "Bad enough?" Ben swore once, creatively and at length. "Road's half hell already. I'll hook up and come." Silas called Iris next, got voicemail, tried again, then left the simplest message he could. "Keep the file set in town if the road opens. Don't trust paper to a storm or a porch." Then he went outside with May. The cold hit harder now. The greenhouse windows rattled in their patched frames. Snow had packed against the lower panels in drifts. Inside, the temperature had already begun to drop despite the covered trays. Silas checked the line, got the backup heater running, then showed May how much fuel remained. "Enough for the night? If the wind doesn't shift worse." May held the lamp higher. Her hair had loosened in the storm and was blowing across her cheek. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." For one moment they stood shoulder to shoulder inside the dim glass structure while outside the storm erased distance and shape. Seed trays, wrapped pipes, condensation along patched panes, their breath in the cold air. Everything fragile, everything ordinary, everything requiring more labor than drama. May set the lamp down. "You chose my mother." Silas kept his eyes on the heater valve. "She needed it." "That's not what I meant." He straightened. May's face in the stormlight looked different than it had on the porch the day he arrived. Not softer exactly, less defended by reflex. "Most people say people come first," she said. "Then they run toward the thing they're most afraid to lose." Silas had no good answer to that, so he gave her the only honest one. "I've done enough losing in the wrong order." The words hung there between them, not pretty enough to be called intimacy, too real to be anything smaller. May looked at him a moment longer, then nodded once, as if filing that sentence away where it might matter later. "Go back inside," she said. "I'll stay 10 more minutes." "No." This time when he said it, it did not carry command. It carried partnership. "We both go back in 5, he said. or we'll have 2 more people for Nora to worry about." To his surprise, May almost smiled. When they returned to the house, the kitchen felt hotter than before. Ben arrived 20 minutes later in a storm-rattled pickup, dragging the old tow generator behind it, like a stubborn iron animal. He burst through the mudroom in blowing snow, beard frosted white at the edges, quilted vest thrown over thermal layers, anger and concern mixed so completely that they became his natural weather. "Where do you want the damn thing?" Silas pointed. Ben was already moving. Between the 3 of them, they ran the backup line, stabilized the feed, and bought the house and greenhouse enough power to survive the next several hours. Ben stayed long enough to drink half a cup of coffee standing up, insult the age of Silas's primary generator, and check Nora's pulse with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands looked built for engines. "She needs warmth and quiet," he said. "And if she worsens, we move at first light, storm or no storm." May nodded. By midnight, the worst of the panic had passed. Nora still breathed shallowly, but more evenly now. May sat in the hallway outside her room, wrapped in a blanket she had forgotten to pull over her shoulders properly. Mako lay against her shin, head on his paws, one eye half open toward the door. Silas sank down on the floor opposite them, back against the wall, exhausted past speech. No one called it victory. The wind still battered the house. Somewhere far off, metal struck wood again, but now it stayed what it was. Weather, not memory. The headlights at the end of the drive had vanished. Iris sent one message through at last, delayed and fragmented, but clear enough. Files secured. Hearing stands. Around 3 in the morning, May finally looked across the narrow hall at Silas. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head once. "Not for that. For knowing which thing had to matter first." That was harder to bear than gratitude. He looked down at Mako, who had not moved from his post between them, and said nothing. Morning came pale and exhausted. The storm did not end all at once. It loosened. The wind stepped back. Snow still drifted from the trees in soft avalanches when the light finally spread over the yard. The backup generator held. The greenhouse stood. Some of the outer cloth had torn free, but the trays lived. The house remained upright under its burden of white. At the end of the drive, there was no vehicle, only tracks half filled by snow leading back toward the road. Nora slept through most of the morning, color returning slowly to her face. May stood at the window with a mug gone cold in her hands. Silas came in from checking the lines, snow in the shoulders of his jacket, and Mako moved between them first, as if taking attendance. No one said the word family. It would have felt too large, too ceremonial, too soon. But something in the house had crossed a line in the night and would not uncross it. They had not won anything permanent. They had simply kept one another through the storm. And that, for one winter morning, was enough to make the farmhouse feel less like a place they occupied, and more like a life they had survived together. The morning after, the storm did not feel triumphant. It felt used up. The sky over the valley had cleared into a pale, brittle blue, the kind that came only after weather had spent itself breaking what it could. Snow still clung to the fences and orchard branches in thick white bands, but the violence had gone out of it. The farm stood under the aftermath as if listening to its own bones. Silas checked the lower line first, then the greenhouse, then the gate. Not because anything new had broken overnight, because the body remembers urgency longer than the mind consents to it. The greenhouse had survived, not elegantly. One panel had cracked at the corner, and the cloth over the early trays had slipped half off in the wind, but the small green starts beneath were still alive. The backup generator had coughed through the last hard hours before dawn, and then settled into an ugly, faithful rhythm. The orchard remained what it had always been in winter, less visible than living, but living all the same. Inside the house, Nora was still sleeping, her breathing easier than it had been in the night. May had finally changed out of the sweater she had worn through the storm and was standing at the sink in a fresh one, the color of weathered slate, one hand around a mug that had long since cooled. When Silas came in, she looked up in the simple way of someone checking whether a person had returned, not whether he deserved to be there. "How bad?" she asked. "Manageable." That word might once have irritated her. Now she only nodded, as if they had both learned that sometimes people choose plain language not to avoid feeling, but to keep it from spilling all over the floor. The hearing was at 9. Ben Harrow came by a little after 7, with his beard still rough from sleep and his truck wearing a crust of salt and thawing ice. He did not enter so much as occupy a doorway with practical disapproval. "You look worse than my generator," he told Silas by way of greeting. "It's yours now?" Silas asked. "If I had any sense, I'd take it back before you kill it with optimism." But he came in, stamped snow from his boots, and handed over a folded statement written on lined paper in blunt block letters. It confirmed what he had seen over the last week. Occupancy, repairs, active greenhouse use, livestock feed deliveries, road access kept open by current residents. Nothing lyrical, nothing inflated. Exactly the sort of thing that carried weight because it had no interest in sounding important. May accepted it first. Ben noticed that, and some old mechanic's instinct for reading the truth in a room showed in the brief pause before he let go of the paper. "Your mother up?" he asked. "Resting," May said. Ben nodded once, then looked toward the hall where Nora's door remained shut. "Good." Iris arrived 10 minutes later in a dark coat and gloves the color of wet asphalt, already halfway inside the day mentally. She carried a hard folder under one arm and a legal pad under the other, her hair pinned back too quickly to be elegant, but too efficiently to come undone. "Before anyone says anything hopeful," she said, setting the folder on the table, "today is not about winning. It's about making it inconvenient to move against you cleanly." Ben grunted. "That your version of encouragement? It's my version of accuracy." Silas almost smiled. They went over the documents one last time. The hand-drawn map from his father, Ben's statement, Iris's occupancy paperwork, receipts for feed, pipe insulation, hardware, seed trays, kerosene, photographs May had taken on Iris's advice, greenhouse shelves repaired, seedlings started, the wood stack restocked, the east room occupied, the bread oven in use, the coop repaired. Evidence not of nostalgia, but of function. Iris tapped each set in order as she spoke. "You are not trying to prove this place is perfect. You are proving it is active. That matters more." "What if he challenges the map?" Silas asked. "He probably will, but he doesn't have to lose every inch to lose momentum." She looked at him over the top of her pad. "That's the part men like Gideon hate most. Delay." May stood at the table with both hands braced on its edge. There was no visible trembling in her, but Silas knew enough now to recognize the particular stillness she entered when fear had to be folded smaller to become useful. "You think he came out last night?" she asked. Iris's expression didn't soften, but it shifted slightly toward concern. "I think men who prefer deniability like to remind people they can reach the edges of a place without stepping inside it." Ben snorted. That's a fancy way to say he's a coward. Cowards cause real damage all the time, Iris said. Let's not romanticize bravery where none is required. No one argued. Nora did not come to the hearing. By the time she woke, the others were already preparing to leave, and it became immediately clear she was well enough to be offended, but not well enough to spend 3 hours in county chairs, under bad heat and fluorescent lights. I've sat through enough public nonsense for one lifetime, she murmured from the east room, blanket up to her waist, silver hair loose around her temples. Bring me back the truth, not the performance. May bent to fix the quilt more securely over her legs. For a moment her hand rested there, quiet and sure. Mako stayed. That decision, unlike most of his, required discussion only because it did not. When Silas whistled once toward the mudroom, the dog followed, then stopped in the hall outside Nora's room and looked back. Not disobedient, deliberate. Nora glanced at him and smiled faintly. Well, seems I've been assigned security. Silas stood there longer than the moment called for. Then he nodded once. Watch her. Mako sat down by the doorway as if the instruction had only formalized what he had already decided. The county hearing room was smaller than memory made it, and uglier than it deserved to be. Beige walls, folding chairs, a long table at the front beneath the county seal, a coffee urn in the corner that smelled more official than drinkable. People came in carrying winter coats and private loyalties, trying to look as though they had only arrived out of civic curiosity. Gideon Voss was already there. Silas recognized him at once, not because villains announce themselves, because certain men wear civility too carefully. Gideon stood near the side table speaking in low tones to a clean-faced man in a suit, one gloved hand resting lightly over a file binder, as if documents were merely another category of property. He was in his early 50s, maybe a little past, with a narrow face arranged into composure so exact it became its own kind of vanity. His hair, silver at the temples, was neatly set. His coat was dark and expensive without begging to be noticed. Everything about him suggested a person who preferred power to arrive scented and pressed. When he saw Silas, he didn't look surprised. That irritated Silas more than open calculation would have. Mr. Reed, Gideon said, stepping over with a smile whose warmth had been subcontracted. I'm sorry the weather gave you such a rough welcome home. Silas kept his hands at his sides. Funny. Didn't think you were the welcoming type. Gideon let the line pass as if poor manners were a minor tax he occasionally paid to less polished men. His gaze drifted once toward May, then back to Silas. Not leering, not dismissive, assessing. I'm hoping today clears up a few misunderstandings, he said. Iris appeared beside Silas at that exact moment, file folder in hand. Then we agree on at least one goal. Gideon's smile thinned by a degree so small, most people would have missed it. The hearing itself was neither dramatic nor clean. That was what made it real. No one gasped at the map. No one slammed a hand on the table. There was no courtroom revelation, no public humiliation, no neat moment in which truth rose and the wicked sat down. There were questions, objections raised politely, clarifications requested, county members leaning over papers with expressions that suggested boredom, caution, and self-protection in unequal measure. Gideon's representative argued that the property had suffered long-term decline, that current use appeared improvised and recent, that the proposed winter access adjustment would benefit regional development and reduce unnecessary inefficiency. Such language always came wrapped in reason. That was its talent. Then Iris spoke. She did not perform outrage. She did not flatter the board. She walked them through chronology, classification, and active use with the calm precision of someone who had spent too many years watching important things get stolen under tidy verbs. Temporary residency documents, receipts, active repairs, agricultural starts, existing alternate haul route marked in prior use records and supported by the read map. Ben's statement. A note from the church pantry confirming food deliveries to the property had been resumed in the current residents' names. 2 short attestations from neighbors who had once preferred silence and now preferred not to be left alone with it. Silas spoke only when asked directly. That helped. He described the old haul track, the greenhouse restoration, the waterline system, and why the proposed new access was not functionally necessary. He did not speak like a hero reclaiming a legacy. He spoke like a man learning to tell the truth without dressing it in shame or righteousness. May spoke too. Not long, but enough. She stated how long she and Nora had occupied the property, the repairs completed, the use of the kitchen, greenhouse, coop, and east room, the current seasonal plans for production and sale. Her voice remained steady all the way through. Only once did she falter on the word home, and even then she corrected course without apology. Gideon did not crumble. He recalculated. Silas watched it happen in real time, the elegant retreat of a man who understood when open pressure would now cost more than it yielded. The board did not reject everything Gideon wanted forever. What they did was worse for him in the short term and better for the people at Reed Farm. They delayed the access adjustment pending fuller review. They accepted active operational evidence as sufficient to suspend immediate reclassification. They required further assessment of alternate existing routes. Momentum was all Gideon had ever really owned here. And for now, momentum was gone. Outside, under a thin noon sun and old snow dropping from the eaves, Gideon buttoned his coat as if the morning had merely inconvenienced him. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Silas looked at him. Didn't think it was. Gideon gave a small nod, the kind one businessman might give another over a table after terms had changed. Then he stepped into his waiting vehicle and left without drama, which suited him better than defeat would have. The drive back to the farm felt longer than the drive in. Not because anyone was afraid, because relief often moves more slowly through a body than dread. May sat with her hands folded over her gloves, looking out the window. Iris had gone back to town to begin the next layer of paperwork, because women like her understood that survival is often secured in the quiet, after everyone else mistakes a pause for an ending. Ben had returned to his garage muttering about lunch and county chairs and the death of useful civic architecture. At the farm gate, Silas stopped the truck and stared for a long moment at the weathered post where the old Reed sign had once hung. There was still, technically, another option. 2 days earlier, before the storm, he had taken a call from a regional conservation trust, willing to make an offer on the land. Fair, uncomplicated, enough money to settle the property, fund a cleaner future somewhere else, and step away without more hearings, more repairs, more memory. All afternoon, that fact sat in his mind like a key in a locked drawer. May noticed his silence. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he did something he had spent much of his life avoiding. He told the truth before it became urgent. "There's an offer on the property," he said, "from a conservation group." May looked at him fully then, not startled, simply attentive in the way a person becomes when the floor might be about to tilt. "And?" "Enough to leave clean." The words hung there. She turned back toward the windshield. Snowlight moved across her face in pale bands. "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing a smart man would take," He gave a short breath. Maybe. May nodded once, but she said nothing else. No plea, no argument, no bargain disguised as dignity. The absence of pressure from her made the next part possible. Silas rested both hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead at the farm, the greenhouse, the patched roofline, the smoke lifting from the chimney where Nora waited inside. For a long time, he said, I thought leaving without choosing was the same as freedom. He swallowed once. Turns out that was just another way of disappearing. May looked at him again, and this time whatever passed between them was not fragile. It was clear. He went to Iris the next day with instructions. Not charity, not permission, structure. By the end of the week, the papers began to take shape. Nora would have long-term residency rights in the East Room and access to the kitchen, cellar, and front garden as long as she wished. May would not remain as a grateful dependent. She would enter a formal operating agreement with Silas for the greenhouse, orchard, and winter kitchen enterprise. Seasonal produce, preserves, baked goods, seedlings. A small but steady model. A handful of temporary rooms prepared over time for travelers caught in weather or older women needing a few nights of warmth and no questions. Ben repaired the front gate with more care than he admitted. Iris drew up the agreements with language strong enough to survive sentiment. Nora objected to the phrase East Room beneficiary until Iris changed it to something plainer and better. The rehook of it came on a morning so ordinary it almost escaped notice. Silas and May stood at the gatepost together with a new board resting across two sawhorses, paint tin open, brush in May's hand. Pencil behind Silas's ear for no reason, except that he'd put it there while measuring and forgotten to remove it. Behind them, through the front window, Nora sat wrapped in a shawl with a cup of tea, watching without interfering. Mako lay in the snow between the two humans, tail tapping once, then again, against the packed white. May painted the last letter slowly, then leaned back to see the whole of it. Reed Orchard and Winter House, no fanfare, no speech, just a name chosen with enough care to hold what the place had become. Silas took the board from one end. May took the other. Together they lifted it into place. When it was done, they stepped back. The sign did not erase the past. It did something harder. It admitted the past had not been enough on its own. Beside him, May's shoulder brushed his for half a second in the cold. This time neither moved away too quickly. The farm behind them was still imperfect, still weather-beaten, still full of work and weather and legal complications waiting for their turn. But it was no longer surviving on memory alone. It had been chosen back into being. And for the first time in a very long while, Silas did not feel like a man passing through a life. He felt, quietly and without spectacle, that he had remained. Sometimes the grace of God does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as a warm room kept alive by tired hands, a door reopened after years of silence, or the courage to stay when running would feel easier. This story reminds us that healing often begins when someone chooses not just to remember what was lost, but to care for what is still alive. In daily life, that may look small, checking on someone, offering a place at the table, or refusing to give up on a corner of life that still needs you. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what staying has meant in your own life. And if you'd like more stories like this, subscribe and come back anytime. May God bring peace to your home, steadiness to your heart, and light enough for the next step.